Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the Simcoe Muskoka Catholic District School Board's reopening of schools live stream event. My name's Mark Littlewood, and tonight I'm going to be your moderator. I also happen to be the board's health and safety officer. So some of the questions might actually get directed my way tonight. We've got a large audience tonight, and we are sure that there's going to be a lot of questions. As we're going to answer as many of those questions as we possibly can during the event itself. Please be advised, though, we're also using our communications team to answer questions online as in a live format as we move through this. For other questions that maybe we don't get to, we do have a process set up to engage those questions into our board's FAQ section for the reopening of schools. I guess before we get to the questions, we do have a panel of school board experts and some experts from outside of our organization, and I'd like to take a brief moment to introduce those if I could. So to my left, we have Dr. Pat Carney, our chief psychologist for the board. Next to Dr. Carney, we have Kathy McCullough, our interim director of education. To my right, I have Superintendent Lonnie Bolton, superintendent of elementary schools. Next to Lonnie, we have Dr. Lisa Simon, Associate Medical Officer of Health for the Simcoe Muskoka District Health Unit. And then next to Lisa, we have John Barbato from the Simcoe County Transportation Consortium. As I said, we have probably a lot of questions, so let's get right to it because we do have about an hour of live time tonight. So, with that said, you might see me looking down at my little iPad here. This is where my questions are streaming in. We'll try and sift and sort the best questions that we're getting in. So we got a question from Kim. Kim is concerned about the latest media report that states basically that for our high school students, they will be in one classroom for 5 hours per day. And that's on a rotating weekly schedule. Kim's wondering if that is actually a correct publication. The information that's out there is accurate. I think for that one, I'm going to pass it over to Kathy McCullough, our interim director of education.
So Kim, yes, that's absolutely correct. So I'll just give a little bit of background to it. We are a board that we're running a quadmester. And what a quadmester means is we're going to be doing 2 subjects for the first half of the semester and then 2 subjects for the second half of the semester. And so the methodology or thinking behind the one subject was basically based on the cohorts. And as you're aware, the cohorts in our secondary schools are to minimize student contact with no more than 100 contacts. So definitely looking at safety as being a paramount factor in this. And so what the students will be experiencing is a subject, their subject for most of the day, with breaks in between, and an opportunity towards the end of that day for sort of facilitated learning that would happen. So that means 1 week on of that one subject with the same teacher, and then the next week their other subject. And again, it's putting safety first, making it a paramount priority of ours. And so we're trying to look at the positive aspects of that. First of all, it's a safe transition for some of our students who haven't been in school since March. We're really looking at leveraging, experiential learning. It certainly has some positive benefits for certain subjects. For example, broad-based technology or art or any of those subjects that really give our students an opportunity to go in deep. We recognize it's very unconventional, but it's the safest and best step forward at this time. So thank you, Kim.
Thanks, Kathy. On to our next question. Our next question comes in from Ava. And Ava has a question about what is the protocol should a student, while at school, start to show symptoms of COVID-19? That's actually a developmental part of a document that we have put out that is really designed to guide our school administration, in fact, everyone in our school environment, as to how to respond to instances when we have that. I'm going to defer some of the question to Lonnie Bolton, but I think also Dr. Simon can really speak to the expectations. We develop all of our protocols around symptomatic students and et cetera, based on Simcoe Muskoka District Health Unit guidance, and we incorporate that into our action plan, basically. Lonnie?
Thank you, Mark. And Ava, if there is any suspected or case of COVID, or if there's a student exemplifying any symptoms that might be very similar, we would have, and we do have, as Mark mentioned in his response, a protocol in the schools that we will have that student brought down to an isolation room. And once they're in the isolation room, we will be contacting parents to make sure that their child is collected, and we're going to advise that they seek medical attention. There will be nothing in our document that will substantiate the need to that family to prove there's no COVID before they return, but we are asking that once they return to school that they have been symptom-free for up to 24 hours. There's one process for the school, but then if there is any confirmed case of COVID-19, it would fall into protocol management from the Ministry of Health. Lisa, you may have some parts you'd like to add to that.
Sure, yeah, thanks for that. So just to add a little bit to that, so if a student is showing any symptoms when they're at school, they would be isolated as was discussed, and they'd be asked to be picked up immediately. And the direction to the family would be to get them tested for COVID-19. And while they're awaiting their test result, themselves and other members of their household should be at home self-isolating. And we're going to be very cautious about this so that students who have any symptoms would be recommended to go through this same process, because COVID can present itself in many different ways, particularly in children. So the child and the family members would be self-isolating at home while awaiting the test. If the test result is negative, then they can return to school if they are symptom-free for 24 hours. If the test result is positive, then they will hear from public health, and we will talk with the family about how to manage them as a case of COVID. We will figure out who the rest of their contacts are and go from there. But typically, if somebody is actually diagnosed with COVID, they would be needing to self-isolate for 14 days at home.
Thank you, Dr. Simon. Next question that we have came in from Carlene. Carlene is wondering, will speech and language assessments still be completed this year? Previous to this, theirs was canceled, no doubt as a result of COVID. I think maybe, Lonnie, you might be able to speak to that question.
I can, thank you. Rest assured that any of the services that may have been discontinued in the first round of school closure, we have now reimagined how those will look as we reopen schools. And it could come in two forms. We are going to be complying with public health parameters as we introduce itinerant staff into our schools, our speech and language supports, as well as we have now dabbled in the world of having those services performed virtually if necessary. So the services will still, if they're required for the students' development and they are provided in their individual education plan, there will be no discontinuation of that. They will carry on.
Thanks, Lonnie. Our next question comes in from Andrea. Andrea is wondering whether the remote learning will be starting at the same date at our school board at the same time as when other in-class instruction starts, I believe. Maybe Kathy, you could answer that question?
Sure. So as everyone is aware, school starts September 8th. And right now as we speak, we are validating the numbers of students that wish to partake in remote learning. We're suspecting it'll be around the 4,500 mark. So with about 22,000 students in our system, that speaks to about roughly 20% of our students. So once we have those numbers validated, then we begin filling the classes, the remote learning classes. So in terms of your specific question with start date, certainly the first week of school when all the other students are in school, we'll begin slowly by introducing the e-learning concept, the overview of the curriculum. We're going to have to be doing some teacher training because those teachers are just finding out late next week what they'll be teaching. But effectively, we're looking at an official start of September 14th. However, I just want to preface that by saying there will be outreach to students prior to that September 14th date.
Thanks, Kathy. Next question comes in from Leanna, and Leanna has a question concerning her child and whether, when they're outside, do they have to wear a mask? That is, again, part of the protocols that we've been developing to provide guidance to our school administration. There has certainly been some advice that when children are outside, they need to play. We want them to play. Are any restrictions in place on that? Again, it becomes slightly a personal choice of that family. But I think from our perspective, Lonnie, we have some language that says if you are outside and you can maintain social distancing, that in fact, masks can be taken off. In fact, we're anticipating that we will have to resupply a number of masks because they may get lost on the playground. So we're trying to develop some very tight processes around how people can, hang on to their masks. Lisa, any additional points on that for outside use of masks?
Sure, yeah. So for kids, like for the general public health guidance is that when we're outside, the risk of transmission is somewhat less. It's certainly still possible, but it's somewhat less because of the air circulation around us. So that's one reason. And the other one is that for students, it's going to be important to have breaks in the day from that mask use. Anyone who's tried to wear a mask the entire day, it's a long time. So it's very important to wear it inside for the protection it provides, but it's also important to have a break from it outside. So therefore, it will be permitted to take masks off, or at least the public health recommendation is that it's acceptable, absolutely, to have masks off when outside, but the other precautions would still be in place, right? So if you're at recess time, for example, and you're outside, you may have your mask off, but you're still trying to maintain some distance, particularly for the older students. There would be the expectation of maintaining distance from others, and you would still be trying to stay within your cohort as much as possible. So while the masks are off, the rest of the precautions would still be in place.
That's great. Thanks, Lisa. Next question we have coming in is actually coming in from Kathy. And Kathy is wondering what the JKSK program for learning will look like in the amended sort of structures that we're having to exist in due to COVID-19. Lonnie, any thoughts on how the JKSK program is going to look this year?
Thank you, Mark. Yes, just to go back a bit, we did have a summer learning project over the summer, and we had over 300 students in it. And of those 300 students, we had over 60 JKs that were involved in our summer project, and that involves synchronous learning. We were very pleased on how that program is progressing, and we were very amazed at the creativity of our teachers and the commitment of the families and the students to that program. So if we reach into that exercise, we're looking at our JK program, seemingly looking reimagined. Teachers will have to be slightly creative, and it's the first day for everybody. As we go back, the JKs is their first day, as well as it's the first day for our kindergarten teachers in this new synchronous environment. They will be re-looking at how they do things, but all in all, it'll be a blend of at least 180 minutes of synchronous learning and the balance of the day in asynchronous. And we're very hopeful that that's going to go very, very well.
Thanks, Lonnie. Next question comes in from Jamie Lynn. Jamie's question basically is related to the selection process that parents were asked to make for part of the registration, whether it was going to be in-class learning or remote learning. The question is actually, can we change our choice now that we have new information for the high school year, or are we stuck with what we answered until February when we can change our options? I think that's a question that I'd like to put over to Kathy. There has been a lot of discussion on this topic.
So that's a very important question. And I think if parents have changed their mind, we are trying to finalize that data this week because we can't effectively staff our schools or our remote learning classrooms without having that information. So if you have changed your mind, then you need to work through your school principal and make your school principal aware of that as soon as possible, because we're really trying to close that off. Actually, it was closed off today, but certainly there's always extenuating circumstances. That's number one. Number two is if a parent does make a selection for their child for remote learning or for classroom learning, there will be specific transition points. So in the case of secondary, it would be at the end of the semester. So for example, let's say you chose remote learning for your child, and at the end of semester 1, you want to go back to the in-class portion of learning, then absolutely. The issue with secondary is students cannot transfer back and forth in the midst of the instruction. With elementary, it'll be based on the term. So in other words, if the kids are participating in remote and they want to go back to the regular class, we have to wait again to the end of the term, and that would be around the November timeframe.
Thanks, Kathy. Our next question comes in from Daisy. Daisy is wondering whether if there is a symptomatic or COVID positive case within a classroom, would other parents be advised of that fact? You have to understand that today was the actual initial release by the province of the outbreak protocols for school boards. We have just started to work through that in conjunction with the Simcoe Muskoka District Health Unit. I will defer to some extent to Dr. Simon on this protocol. As I said, it's relatively new, and we are working through those implementation phases.
So if a child is symptomatic, I mean, that could be one of many things. Right? We know that kids can have lots of different viruses that cause similar symptoms, but that's why that child would quickly be required to be picked up and tested for COVID. But there would be no further notification at that point. When things kind of step up a notch, certainly, is if a child or a staff member were to be diagnosed with COVID. So if that were the case, the Public Health Unit, Muskoka District Health Unit, we would receive the laboratory result, and we would follow up at that time in a number of regards with the individual and their family to support what that student needs to be doing. But we would also be looking into in detail who their contacts have been during the period of time that they would have been contagious. And whoever would be relevant to be followed up with in that regard, we would then contact. So if the child had been in class and had been contagious during that time, based on new protocols that were released by the provincial government today, in all likelihood we would be requiring all students in the cohort of that student, which would be their classroom, and any other cohorts they're a part of. It might be the bus, it might be after school, and so forth. So any of their cohorts may receive notification that there has been a case, that they don't need to know who it's been because that's private information, but that there has been a case that their child has been exposed, and that their child is therefore required to be self-isolating at home for 14 days. So it's a case-by-case scenario where public health will decide, who has been exposed and therefore who needs to be notified so that they can take appropriate action.
Thanks, Lisa. I think our next question is actually very closely related to this. It comes from Sandra, and her question is that if one of her 3 children at the school is identified and sent home because they're displaying COVID symptoms, what happens to her other 2 children that day?
So some of these protocols are actually still being worked out and will be fine-tuned by the time school begins, because as I said, actually the protocols were just officially released by the provincial government today. But I believe that if one child shows symptoms of any kind, that all children in that school, given that they're all household contacts that are in that school or other schools should in fact be going home, because the symptomatic child is going to need to be tested for COVID, and while awaiting that test result, that child and all of their household contacts should also be self-isolating at home.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Our next question comes from Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is wondering, how does the morning drop-off look like at our schools? Are all the kids going to be playing on the yard at the same time? How does that work with their relationship to the cohorts and the formation of the cohorts? I think maybe in part this is going to be a little bit of a story between ourselves and the Transportation Consortium, because the Transportation Consortium, in some cases, obviously, is dropping students off through the busing process. Would you like to speak a little bit about that, John?
Sure. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Elizabeth. From a busing perspective, with all of our drop-offs in the morning, they're typically staggered, so the students will be arriving in a staggered pattern, and as they exit the bus, they will follow the direction of the school administration.
Great, thanks, John. To the point that when the students get to the school, we have been working through a number of models, and we've actually done basically what we would consider to be a couple of dry runs now at schools. And obviously it's very dependent on the school site itself and the geography of that school. But we are looking at a process whereby once we have the students in the schoolyard, they will be very rapidly formed up into their cohorts. They'll be put into areas where we know who's going in their staggered formations, basically, and then they'll be going into the school and straight to their classrooms. Next question we have is from Jenny. For children currently on an IEP, what will happen with that? Will the children who need extra support, like EAs, will that still be available? That's a question that I know is very close to Lonnie's activities, so I'm going to ask Lonnie to speak to that question.
Thank you, Mark. Great question, Jenny. The individual education plan, prior to the pandemic, we know those supports you'd have for your child. If you are choosing to have your child in school, those support structures would look the exact same. The only difference would be the public health measures, the distancing, potentially masking and visor wearing, and all those things. If your child, if you have chosen remote learning for your child and they are now in a distance format, we are currently looking at a model where even though your child may not be at the home school, we want to maintain the relationship with those significant adults that support your child, i.e., that would be the special education resource teacher. They would support your child through a synchronous exercise, maybe every day, parts of a day, and as well as, if applicable, if your child does require EA support, that EA would be provided an opportunity each day, part of a day, to through a remote exercise to connect with your child, so that in the home, we have to reimagine their goals will look differently in the home, and we'll support the family in reimagining what those goals will look like in that different environment, and the supports will be there remotely.
Great, thanks, Lonnie. Spacey has a question, and it relates to students who, is there a process that they could potentially be waitlisted if they try to transition to in-class learning at the transition point this year?
No, I don't imagine a wait list, because it's basically comes down to a reallocation of staff. So that's why we need defined entry and re-entry processes, because that basically means we're moving our staff around. So our teaching staff, our ECEs, our EAs, whomever might be needed to support the learning. So that's why we have to have sort of defined transition points. So no, there won't be a wait list, but there will be entry and exit times defined so that we can, I'm sure you can appreciate, because we have to staff all of our schools, and our schools are staffed based on enrollment, and so that's why those defined transition times informs our enrollment. So I hope that addresses your question.
Thanks, Kathy. Next question comes from Carolina, and this is related to remote learning. For students enrolled in remote learning, is the student expected to be in front of their computer for the entire 4+ hours? Or will there be breaks within that 4-hour period? So I guess the question becomes is, what does the structure of that day look like for the remote learning students?
So that's a very good question. The guidelines for remote learning were just released to us last week, and there's very defined times or minutes, and it's called, I use the two terms, synchronous or asynchronous learning. Synchronous learning means that your child is learning basically at the same time all the other students are learning. So let me use an example. So if it's a grade 3 child that grade 3 child is learning, at the very defined same times as the other children in the grade 3 class. Asynchronous learning means that would be the additional learning that child would participate in, let's say, a 300-minute day. For our little ones, for JK to 3, it's 180 minutes of synchronous learning. So in response to that, will there be breaks? Yes, there will definitely be breaks, because our kids who are in the regular classroom require lots of breaks. Especially for young children, they're active, and we recognize that's a lot of screen time. But bear in mind, there is a teacher who is teaching over the screen, so there will be lots of experiential activity, lots of evidence-based strategies for e-learning, and just a whole host of other really creative strategies. Lonnie referred to our summer learning program, and so we have lots of best practice to pull from and to utilize to make this a big success for your child.
Thanks, Kathy. Next question comes in from Jenny, and Jenny would like to know why class sizes are not reduced. Some of the areas that would be of concern to Jenny are areas like the portables, where they can be seen as being a smaller environment at times. I think in part, for the size of the classes, we are following provincial guidance with respect to class sizes in a non-designated board. In terms of the portables themselves, portables generally have a reasonably similar sized footprint to a lot of our regular in-building classrooms. They're generally set up the same way. One of the things that we are doing is ensuring that when we look at the setup of those spaces, that our desk arrangements and our seating plans are consistent with our desire to maximize space between the students in that available space.
Can I just add to that?
Certainly.
In addition, what's happened over the summer, and just to expand on that, it's a lot of classrooms had like soft furnishings and additional items that were in the classroom, and over the summer months, all of that has been removed. So there's actually extensive space now in some of our classrooms. So that's another factor. And I think I said earlier, just a reminder that right now about 20% of our students look like they'll be participating in remote learning. So our school populations will be smaller. And so I think that's an important factor to take in mind. So when you think about concentration of students in a school or in the hall or in the yard, I think that's also something to complement what you said, Mark.
That's absolutely correct, Kathy. Based on an observation I made yesterday while I was out visiting a school, we have done, I think, a very good job of depopulating our classrooms of extraneous materials. We've taken out a lot of even some of our own materials have been moved off to the side. We have new patterns of seating going in. Again, all designed to maximize the space between students and promote a safer environment. Next question comes in from Maurizio. How will the lunch period work in high schools? Will the students remain in their classrooms like in the public board? They're doing that to ensure extra protection for their students. Kathy?
So yes. So again, going back to the cohort, so I think it's understanding that the cohorts are such that we are minimizing students' contact, not only with students who are outside of the 100 cohort, but movement in the halls and so on. And so yes, students' instruction will be in the classroom. Lunch will be in the classroom with supervision, of course, and then carrying on the remainder of the learning for the rest of the day. In fact, our timetable, the timetable that we're running and that I'm describing will be replicated throughout the province. So this isn't just something that's Simcoe Muskoka. It's this particular quadmester timetable is throughout the province. So I just wanted to make that distinction. And also make the distinction that there are 72 boards in the province and 24 of them are designated. So you hear a lot about boards like Toronto and Halton and Durham. Those boards are designated. That means they've had higher incidences of COVID in their communities, and so they're on an adapted timetable. So in other words, those students are not in school and their timetables are different than our kids. So we are actually one of the fortunate boards because we've had, and I hope Lisa will speak to this, we've had relatively low incidences of COVID, and so we're able to operate like a full elementary timetable and a quadmester approach in secondary. But regardless, despite the low incidence of COVID, we're taking every precaution to ensure that we keep with that cohort model of 100 in secondary and 50 in elementary. So I think, Lisa, it might be helpful too if you speak to, I just think it's important that we give a snapshot of our community because I think that paints a different picture and certainly will bring lots of comfort to our parent community. So if you'd be so kind.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So as was said, the rates of COVID that we've seen in the Simcoe-Muskoka region have been considerably lower than the provincial average. We've certainly seen COVID, we've managed it, we've gotten comfortable with how to control it, but our rates have been considerably lower than the average and lower than the more densely populated areas, and that's why, as was spoken to, we would be considered a non-designated board. So the real only distinction that's made there from Ministry of Education guidelines in terms of prevention in schools is with regards to the timetable, as was talked about, but really most of the other precautions, if not all of them, are the same across the board, and the protocols that will be in place in our region will be very strong and appropriate for preventing COVID from entering the schools and then preventing further transmission if it were to be introduced. So those precautions will be in place. And I think that the other thing that I'd add is that the rates recently in particular have been quite low across Ontario and certainly including Simcoe-Muskoka, and that's really the reason why it is safe for schools to be opening up at this time. This is the time to do it. You know, we know that many children and families have struggled being at home away from school with all the benefits that school offers, and so with our rates being low right now, it reduces the likelihood of there being transmission in the school setting, and it really makes it the time to be able to do this with the precautions in place.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Next question comes in from Teresa, and I've had a little bit of an opportunity to read this question a couple of times, so I'm going to tell Lonnie right now. I'm going to direct it his way, and I'll explain why, but I also think that Dr. Pat Carney will probably want to discuss this issue as well. Teresa asks, we realize that health and safety is important for secondary, and all-day, everyday model is the best for that. However, it could have extremely negative impacts on the mental health of teens without social interaction, air, and freedom. The reason I want to direct it first to Lonnie is that many of us at this table, in this panel rather, are actually parents ourselves. And I know for a fact that Lonnie has a daughter who is going into grade 9. And so this new normal is going to be certainly part of her life. So over to you, Lonnie.
Thank you, Mark. And as Mark mentioned, I have a daughter of my own transitioning from elementary going into grade 9 in one of our secondary schools. So going back to the question about maybe the opportunities that are lost in this model, and there are some opportunities to be gained. Some of our students that are coming from a small elementary school, they might find it very daunting to walk into a big secondary school with 700, 800 students. So in this model, when they're kept to a cohort, they are really, although they're on the surface it might seem like there's some contraction in their ability to, socially interact, they're going to start off small. They're going to start off with 20 new friends, they get to know the cohort, and as well as we go into week 2, they'll be introduced to a different 20. It's a graduated way for us to get all of our students back. There are some academic components that are really beneficial. We think about the experience of all of our students that have not been attending school since March. There may have been some gaps in their learning realized, that once they go into this model of one class the whole day, it would give that teacher a real opportunity to know the learning profile of every student, do those diagnostic assessments, and do that remediation work so that every child we can meet them where they're at and get them to where they need to be. The other part is just reaching back to a previous question around special education students or students with special education needs, this is a really good model that when we introduce them into this model that we can make sure that they do one course at a time. We can provide them their support through their special education resource teacher, one course at a time. So we can find some efficiencies in this model. So there might be some loss in normalcy, but we do have to seize the opportunity to make sure that this new model that is on us, we find the benefits in that too.
That's great, thanks, Lonnie. Pat, could I get you to speak to this issue as well?
I think, Catherine, you mentioned before the business of teachers showing creativity,
Yes.
and that there's a real opportunity here to make the best of this. I was talking to a neighbor the other day who was in the situation before, being in the same class all the time. He said it was fantastic. We really got to know the teacher, we really got to know each other, and that really struck me because from a psychologist's point of view, connecting with students and making positive mental health is all about relationships. And so it really allows the teacher to get to know each of the students better, not only for academic reasons, but emotional reasons and social reasons. But it has to be worked. And we often have in school kids that are kind of suffering and they fly below the radar. Nobody knows that they kind of keep their eyes down and they go. Well, that teacher's going to get to know that student, and there's a better opportunity for an earlier intervention and strategies put in place to connect. So it'll have to be a system where people adjust to that situation and make the best of it. And I'm quite encouraged about some opportunity being there for mental health reasons, actually. Yeah.
Pat, would you mind saying something, because I think it's very related to this question, about how resilient and adaptable the children that you've worked with, or in general children are? So I think that would be an important piece to complement that question.
Sure, that's the fun of being a psychologist, and I'm sure the fun of being a teacher is to take somebody that's learning or struggling or whatever and watch them get their wings. And that has to do with the child's curiosity, it has to do with their interest, their desire to please. There's so many things that are there for the having in terms of that resilience that's built into that little motor the child walks around with. So that's the thing. In the relationships that we're developing, there's a real opportunity to get to know the child. And we always say to teachers, it's easy to teach the 2 or 3 kids that always have their hands up and are looking to please and connect and have their homework done and get it. It's getting the chance to develop the relationship with the student that sits back and is harder to get to know, or sometimes even hard to like. This really provides an opportunity to do that and to tap into the natural strengths. Every child comes with their own individual strengths. To get to know that and then connect the curriculum to the child's interests and strengths is key.
Great, thanks, Pat. Next question comes from Catherine. Catherine would like to know, are the elementary students going to be sharing the buses with the high school students? That's probably a question that would be best answered by John.
Thanks, Mark, and thank you, Catherine. To support the full return to school, buses will run following the ministry's guidelines in the same fashion they've run in past years. Some of the changes that will be made to the bus this year will be assigned seating, and that follows the guidelines of the ministry as well as the public health unit. Where we have shared buses, we will make efforts to separate the students by school so that we're keeping them in separate cohorts similar to the rest of their school day.
That's great, thanks, John. Next question comes from Alexandra, and I think I'll direct this question to Catherine. The question is, will you be delaying the first day?
At this point, no. We have communicated to all of our parents, our families, our teachers. We are actually doing a staggered start. And the intention of the staggered start was so that our kids could slowly transition into our schools. So for example, for elementary, on the first day of school, there will be kindergarten to grade 3 students that will arrive. And the intent and the purpose of that was so that we could help our little ones develop routines. Some of those children might be coming into the school for the first time, becoming more familiar with the look of the school, being more adaptable in terms of the doors they come in, the new routines. Some of them are going to be on the bus for the first time. And so we felt that with our little ones, if we could provide as much support as possible on the first day, the next day we'll stagger in our 4s, 5s, and 6s, and then the next day our 7s and 8s. So it's really looking at that slow transition model with the intent of optimizing the support and becoming more accustomed to an environment. And I know our kids are really excited to be back at school, excited to see their friends. But again, going back to that adaptability and that resilience, I strongly suspect our kids will become much more accustomed to their new routines in a way sometimes that adults don't. So we're very optimistic, and we're really looking forward to their bright, shining faces on the first day of school.
Thanks, Kathy. John, I think the next question is probably going to be something that you could answer on this one. We got a question in from Pete, and Pete has made the observation that some bus drivers take their children with them on their routes. Are they going to be allowed to do that this year?
Well, thanks, Mark, and thank you, Pete. Yes, the drivers will still be able to take their own children on the school bus route with them. Following the ministry's guidelines, we will be working to maintain the seat behind the driver as much as possible to keep that distance available, and then that seat would be used if the driver were to take their own child on the bus.
Great, thanks, John. Our next question comes in from Tara. Tara would like to know, can elementary students complete their work through the day, or do they have to sit at the computer for 5 hours straight? I think partially we'd answered that question before. Any other points on that one, Kathy?
Well, I think the only thing I want to stress is that your child's going to be in a remote classroom. And I think you just try to envision or visualize that that classroom would be, as close as possible as we could get to the regular classroom, with routines and trying to make all those connections. So no, they will not be sitting there nonstop in front of the computer. In fact, again, I'm going to go back to my earlier comment. We want to try to make it as experiential and interactive as possible. Remote learning is something that this remote learning is going to look very different from the remote learning that we experienced, that our kids experienced from March to June. This will have much more structure, much more specific guidelines and principles around it. And it'll be as close as possible to a regular classroom, whereas I think previous to, we had a range of strategies that were used, and so it would have been, depending on your child's teacher and your child's grade, they might have had a different experience. This will have much more structure to it, and much more guidelines, and a lot of feedback back to parents too, because we cannot create a remote school without giving you an overview, an idea of what the expectations are, especially when it comes to assessment and all those other things. So I think it's going to be just a very different experience than what we experienced from March to June, and a positive experience. We'll make it as engaging and positive for our kids as we possibly can.
Thanks, Kathy. We have actually a lot of people on the line asking a very similar question, and certainly there have been a number of protocols developed around this already. It's what happens if you are symptomatic before you even come to school. So the question is basically, if my kid has the sniffles, do they need to stay at home? What if they have a cough? Those are both often seen as identified symptoms that could be a sign of COVID-19. Lisa, would you like to weigh in on that whole component of that decision-making process about if my child's displaying a symptom, what's my action that's required?
Yeah, absolutely. So part of the plan that is in place to keep schools safe for kids, there are several preventive measures, but one key one, and the first one at the start of the day, is going to be screening your child with a number of questions that you'll want to go through every day with them or with yourself. A tick box of a wide range of symptoms that could relate to COVID. They could also relate to other things, but they could relate to COVID. And you're also going to be asking yourself, have I been in contact with anybody else who's unwell? And also, have I traveled outside of Canada in the past 14 days? So if your child does have any of those symptoms, and that certainly could include the two that were raised, a runny nose or a cough, if that's new for them, then they would screen positive, which means that they're unable to go to school that day. And the recommendation at that point would be that you get them tested for COVID, as I spoke to earlier. So they would need to stay at home until they've had the results of the COVID test. If the COVID test result is negative, then you would wait till their symptoms resolve for 24 hours, and then they can come back to school. If the test result is positive, then as spoken about, they would be a COVID case. But it will be really important, and that's really the key contribution that parents can make to help keep the school environment safe. And it's going to be a big change from usual, because we know that often, kids have runny noses, they have a bit of a cough, but they're still, up around and running and feeling pretty well. And in a usual time, that might be fine for them to be at school. But this year is going to be a different year, and we are really asking parents to do that screening, to be rigorous with it, and to keep kids home in case those are symptoms of COVID.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Our next question comes in from Janine. Janine would like to know, when the kids are on the buses, are they going to be spaced out? Currently, they're up to 3 per seat. John?
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Janine. Well, again, as I said earlier, following the ministry's guidelines to support the full return to school, buses may be at capacity. What I can say is that where we're able to do so, we will be spacing students out throughout the bus. We'll also be following the guidelines where assigned seating is required. So as we assign those seats, we'll be assigning students within the same household to sit together. And again, as I said, we will be working to space them out where we're able to do so.
John, if I could just add to that, our survey that we did, our parent survey, showed that out of all our families, really only 40% of our families at this point have chosen to take the bus. So what I suspect, and I'm sure you will confirm, is that our buses are going to be considerably less crowded, because when you only have 40% of your families taking the bus, then I suspect there's going to be lots of room on the bus for you to be able to implement and follow the ministry guidelines.
Yes, and so what I can say to that is that we have, thank you, we have received the information of the students who will not be taking the bus, and we will be removing them off of our buses, so we will be able to create additional space with the reduction in students on the bus.
Yeah. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Maurizio would like to know, if the remote learning option is chosen and the students don't have contact with their home schools, how will a grade 12 student apply for university? Do they have access to their guidance department? How would they get their graduation photos taken? How would that part of this work? Kathy?
So these are all great questions, so in terms of being, transparent with this, those are the kinds of details and processes that we have to work through. I will tell you this much, is that your student, if they participate in remote learning, they're still very much connected to their school. So those kinds of services like guidance and applying for university or applying for any kind of post-secondary, that kind of support could still be or will still be provided. So even though we're in the remote setting, the idea is that they still have that link and connection to their home school. So be rest assured, we will continue to provide optimum support for your child despite being in a remote learning setting. So more information to come on that.
That's great, thanks, Kathy. Our next question comes from Stephanie. Stephanie would like to know, are there specific cleaning supplies to be used on surfaces, and have they changed from pre-COVID? What are they? I can speak to that one, actually. All of the products that we use for disinfectant purposes within our schools, we run by the health unit because they always want to know, do we have a change in practice in how that material is delivered to the surface? What are the kill properties of that agent in terms of disinfecting a space. So we actually didn't switch out our disinfectant from pre-COVID to now. The disinfectant we were using is called DIS 256. It is a highly effective antiviral disinfectant. It basically, and sanitizer. It has a 10-minute dwell time that we have to now factor that into our custodial cleaning cycle. That is being worked on. The schedules have been established. Custodians are very used to using this product, so that was one of the advantages to having moved to it. So to answer the question in sort of brief, we're using functionally the same product we used before, but it is a highly effective disinfectant cleaner.
Maybe it might be valuable to also mention that we have 3 additional hours of custodial cleaning time.
That's true. Through ministry funding, we were able to get 3 hours of extra cleaning time per school. That's been allocated out to really maximizing our cleaning capacity during the busier times of the day when we want to really get in and repeatedly hit those high touch points. We have staff moving through the school to do that, and it allowed us to implement another cycle of thorough cleaning through the school. We're getting out there twice a day during the day, and there's still an evening shift that goes in and does an additional clean after the end of the school day as well. So the schools are being heavily disinfected.
Good. Thanks, Mark.
Next question, and I may defer this over to Lisa. Because this is one, again, quite frankly, I don't have the answer to, because I do know that there has been ministry, at the Ministry of Health, money set aside for the addition of public health nurses. The question from Leanna is, are the schools going to be getting any of these public health nurses directly?
Sure, happy to speak to that. So yes, there has been provincial funding for public health nurses to be hired across the province. There's an allocation for a certain number of nurses for each health unit, and our health unit is in the process of hiring nurses. The original allocation was to be able to hire 20 nurses, and that will have to cover the entire Simcoe Muskoka region. So there are far more than 20 schools, so it's certainly we won't be in a position, unfortunately, to have a nurse in every school, but we absolutely will be able to have good contact with every elementary and secondary school and provide guidance on a range of things from appropriate preventive practices, screening, what to do if a child is sick, supporting with management if a child does have COVID, contact tracing, and so forth. So they'll play a wide range of roles, liaising between the schools, the school boards, and the health unit. And we are in the process of trying to hire those nurses. We were recently approved to go ahead and do so, and so it will be a staggered process over the coming period of time, with nurses hopefully coming in place over September and October.
That's great, thank you, Lisa. Recognizing that we do have some time constraints, I think we are probably okay to take a few more questions. We know we got started a little bit late today, so I think maybe we'll try and tackle maybe 3 more questions, then some closing remarks, I think, from some of our panelists, and certainly I'll close out with some closing remarks as well, if that's okay. Andrea would like to know, what will elementary outdoor recess look like if students are confined to 50 people cohorts? Will there be more than one cohort outside at the same time? Will there be multiple recess and lunch times to accommodate all the cohorts within the school? That's something that our elementary superintendents and their teams have been working on extensively. I think that I will allow both Kathy and Lonnie to speak to that point as to what the structure of that day is going to look like and how those cohorts are going to be managed through lunches and recesses.
Sure. So Lonnie, do you want to describe a balanced day, because that's what we're conducting in our elementary schools, and if you can explain to our audience about what a balanced day means and what it looks like for not only nutrition breaks but activity for our kids.
Thank you, Kathy. Yes, 26 of our 41 elementary schools currently have what's called a balanced day. I'll get to that in a moment. And the other 15 are in traditional day. As we go into reopening schools, we will have balanced day in all 41 of our schools. And what a balanced day is there is a learning block. There'll be a 40-minute lunch / recess, another learning block, another lunch/recess, and then the end of the day, so that there's balance. 3 learning blocks with 2 breaks. And in those breaks, coming back to the question, there's an opportunity to stagger recesses, stagger lunches, to make sure that not all cohorts are going into the yard at the same time, as well as is a point well taken that each cohort, weather permitting, will be assigned a certain part of the yard. So not only are they going out into cohorts, they are going into certain areas of the yard so that there isn't any intermingling of the cohorts as best as we can. But that's what the Balance Day brings to us, is an opportunity to further stagger, further restructure our lunches and recesses to ensure that cohorting and that distancing.
That's great. And I think I just want to reiterate the importance of our kids having activity and movement, and you know, we talk a lot about their physical health, but you know, we think that's a really important aspect of their social, mental health, and you know, engaging with their friends. I mean, they're children. They need to move. They need to laugh. They need to, you know, we want our schools to be a joyful place for kids. And I think that this opportunity to let our kids outside, that's why we're promoting outdoor education. So even in the regular classroom, we are actually urging our teachers to, you know, throughout the day, get the kids outside. I mean, I know we live in Canada, and we certainly know how to adapt to our climate, but as much as possible, we're encouraging outdoor education, outdoor activity for our kids, elementary and secondary. So I don't know if anybody else on the panel wants to say anything about that, but I really think that's an important you know, aspect for a child's school experience.
Well, I can comment about one of the, we talked about resilience before, but resilience anymore, we talk about the skills children learn, social emotional learning skills that give them resilience, and the importance of them getting together with their peers is to interact, and then there's the guidance and expectation to interact in a caring way, to interact in an empathetic way. And so throughout the day in that classroom, or whether the kids are outside or wherever they are, while they're interacting, there's guidance. And the very first principle in the relationship, is listening to each other. And so we have been talking about, when the children come back, they'll be coming in, some of them with anxieties or concerns or things look differently. It's the listening, and it's listening to in a caring way, and then letting the child know that you get the feeling that their expression, and maybe even saying that you're really excited about this, aren't you? So you're teaching excitement or sadness or whatever, and then staying with that listening long enough to move it then to, if there's problem solving or things we have to teach about how to get along with other kids, that happens along the way too. That's what has been learned over time. Those are the strongest components to teaching resilience, is guiding that interaction of kids when they play and when they interact. So there's the benefit of coming together socially in a school environment.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thanks, Pat. Appreciate that. Melissa raises an interesting question. If a child is in quarantine, would they still have access to education while they're in that quarantine period? Lonnie.
Thank you, Mark. Melissa, so if a child's in quarantine for a certain amount of time, or if they are off for other reasons, I guess the question would be, does their education continue? If they're in a in-school environment, they're a child attending home, it'd be like anything else. If they happen to have an injury that would prevent them from going to school, we'd make arrangements so that work, albeit paper and pen or something through asynchronous or synchronous, would continue that program for your child. So in the instance of quarantine, we would make those same arrangements to make sure that education is delivered to your child, and your child has no break in their educational experience, albeit, and then once they return to school post-quarantine, they can resume their studies with their peers.
Okay, thanks, Lonnie. Certainly appreciate that. Yep, very good question. Nathan is actually wondering, will the same teacher be required to look after both the students in the classroom and online, or will different teachers handle those groups? Kathy, I think that is part of a discussion that we've had in the past about how the virtual school environment is going to look like, so I think you're probably ideally positioned to answer this one.
Okay. I know that, you know, it's a hard concept to wrap your head around. So I want you to think about this for a second. And again, I can go back to a grade 2 or 3 example. There will be so many students who will be experiencing face-to-face learning with the same teacher. And then there may be that same number of students in grade 2, let's say, that are experiencing remotely learning, but with a different teacher. It would be virtually impossible for that same teacher to be able to manage both. So I think the affirming fact about that is that if your child is learning remotely, they're part of a remote classroom. They will be engaging and learning and doing activities remotely with that same teacher, and the same would apply. So we don't have teachers doing both. They're doing one or they're doing the other. It's just one's in the classroom, in the school, and the other one is remote and engaging in learning that way. So I know that could be a bit of a confusing concept, and to be quite honest with you, initially we were all trying to wrap our heads around what this was going to look like, and we now have clearer direction, clearer guidance. We're going to have a remote schools. We're going to have an elementary and we're going to have a secondary remote school, and those schools will have staffs, they will have teachers, they will have EAs, they will have DCECs, they will have staff that support that school. So I guess that's the best way to explain it. And now that we realize that we're going to have, you know, probably over 4,500 students in a remote learning setting, there'll be a principal, there'll be vice principal. You just have to think of it as a school that's operating outside the traditional brick and mortar building. So I hope that addresses the question, but I could understand that confusion for sure.
That's great. Thanks,
Yeah.
Kathy. One of the questions that is re-emerging amongst our Facebook community tonight, and probably we need to provide some additional clarification on, revolves around the whole issue, Lisa, of when you have a child at home who potentially is symptomatic. So parents are kind of questioning and really would like to know if their child has a known chronic condition, or if they have an allergy, and that creates a symptom that appears to fit in with the COVID symptomology, would that still be grounds for them to keep their child home that day? And how, if it's just an issue of the sniffles, would there still be that expectation for testing?
Yeah, good question. Thank you for the clarification. So I think that's important. So really what we're looking for is new symptoms. So if it's a symptom that's routine for your child, you know they have allergies, they have a sniffly nose throughout the season, then that's understood and they're able to come to school if it's nothing new for them. Similar, if there's any other chronic condition that, you know, perhaps they have recurrent headaches or whatever it may be, if you know that is something truly routine for your child, then you're not going to need to have an assessment each time it happens. The issue is if there's a new symptom or an unexplained symptom. That's when we would be encouraging you to get the COVID-19 test. And that would be as little as something that is a new sniffly nose. And I know that probably sounds perhaps even extreme because kids get, you know, runny noses a lot. But it's that, and there is going to be, you know, that there's going to be impact on family in that regard. But that is the balance that we're having to manage in order to open schools and to keep them safe, is to really encourage parents to keep children home if they have any new unexplained symptoms. So by and large, if they have those new symptoms, you're encouraged to go get that COVID test. If you're really not sure, you know, you think there's some other explanation, you think it's something routine for them, you're quite convinced there's something else going on, by all means, kids can get sick for lots of reasons other than COVID. So that's what your healthcare provider is there for. So if you need that assessment, then by all means contact your healthcare provider and they can let you know if they're clear to them that it's something else, or if in fact it's unexplained and you should get the COVID test.
That's great. Thank you, Lisa. Certainly appreciate that clarification. Certainly that's going to be an issue that, you know, parents have to address on basically a daily basis in our new normal. Lindsay was wondering about the funding that was developed for HVAC systems in schools and ventilation in schools. I can speak partially to that one. Ventilation obviously is handled through our facility services department. when you slice out the monies that were received across all the school boards, it's not the massive amount that was first published. However, we're putting our money to good use. One of the things that we're doing is evaluating the 3 main ventilation system types that we have. We're then doing engineering studies on determining what the ventilation capacity and the air exchange rate in the classrooms and through the school is. We are always conscious that we have standards to adhere to with respect to air exchanges in our schools, and the process that we're currently undertaking is designed to maximize that air exchange rate. The other initiative that we're undertaking is that we're upgrading our filter capacities within our filtering systems in the school ventilation systems. You hear a lot about these MERV filters. Well, the MERV filter is a function of how effective a filter is at filtering out particulate. So the recommendation is that we move to filters that are of a MERV 11 or MERV 13 rating, and that is part of the process that we're undergoing right now. We've got our orders in. Obviously, you now have every single school board in the province of Ontario also competing to get MERV 11 and 13 filters, but we got our orders in early, so we're very confident that we'll be able to implement that change to our filtering systems and have our systems set to maximum ventilation as we move early into the school year. So that's a really good question, and thank you for that one. Next question comes from Mary. We've just got a couple more that I think we probably have time to take. Will online classes start on September 8th?
I think we were asked that question, but it's always good to review. As I said earlier, we are between the 8th and the 14th. We're going to be doing outreach to the students and the parents of those students who will be participating in the online school. We need to spend some time doing teacher training. We need to spend some time with our kids, perhaps doing an activity and really teaching them what this remote learning school or setup or classroom is going to look like. So the actual official start date will be September 14th. But again, know that there will be expectations, communication, probably protocols, likely an overview of information that will be provided between the opening of school and the actual official startup of the online program. I hope parents can appreciate that this is a relatively new undertaking, not just for our school board, but for all the school boards in the province. And so the other thing that we're doing, which collaboration is always the key, we've put together some networks of school districts and networks of educators who are going to share best practice and share strategies on how we can do this really well together. There's a lot of power in a network because it just helps you improve and get better and provide the optimum instruction that we can for our kids. So I hope that addresses that question.
I certainly think it does, Kathy. Thank you. Our last question of the evening comes from Yvonne, and it relates to, I think, considerations within our secondary schools. Basically, the question revolves around, well, how do shop classes and gym classes work in high school when we have this rather large block of course time that's being undertaken every day? Lonnie, would you like to speak initially to what that kind of process would look like for gym and shop?
Thank you, Mark. And Yvonne, that's a great question. And you actually bring up two really good subjects to explain. In any of the specialty classes, like shop classes or culinary classes, quite often as a teacher, the first part of a regular class, 75 minutes, would be to set up, they access the curriculum and do activities, and then before the class ends, we take another whole, let's tear everything down. So there's always this opportunity in that 75-minute block where it's compromised slightly because of the setup and then putting stuff away. In a shop environment, this would be the dedicated time on task would be maximized. The startup would happen, the children would get into routines, and they can really sink themselves over a dedicated amount of time into their projects without interruption, and then at the end of the day they can start to put things away. And in fact, pedagogy, or what we call teaching and learning, could be maximized in that environment. The physical education classes are a little bit trickier. So I want to be careful that we're not saying, you know, we're asking the teachers just to be creative. We're asking them to exercise an abundance of caution. So in that regard, in a sporting environment, we want to make sure that they think about non-contact sport. We talk about usage of balls, that that if we're going to use them, that we decommission them for a certain length of time before we have them back into reuse. We're going to be cleaning, and we're doing all those things. The other part is, with the phys ed program, weather permitting, is that we're going to be really capturing that let's get outside. I know that message has been reoccurring this evening, and in those classes, it's a great opportunity to get them outside in the fresh air. And as Lisa mentioned earlier, there's an opportunity to unmask, but all those other precautions would still be in place. So there are some really emerging helpful academic pieces for teachers that we're going to be providing them, to have them rethink how they're going to do it. But we are very, very confident that we can see those classes look slightly different. But there are some advantages, as I mentioned earlier, and we're going to seize those opportunities.
Great, thanks, Lonnie. And to pick up on that just a little bit in relation to the tech classes. Tech classes historically, and because of safety considerations, have always been having a lower population within that class environment to begin with, so it allows for a little more physical spacing to begin with. They're typically very large class spaces anyway. And similar to phys ed, there is going to be some enhanced cleaning that goes on within that environment, because we realize that there's a lot of materials that are being touched in those environments. We will try to have a very regulated fashion of who touches what, and a disinfection process again for any common touch points, and that's going to be consistent throughout our schools. That is one of the major initiatives that we've undertaken to help combat COVID. Kathy, in closing, do you have any final comments you would like to make?
Yes. So one thing I hope that we provided tonight is that we all have a shared purpose. And our shared purpose is we're here for student achievement and well-being. And I firmly believe that our kids, our students, are looking forward to coming back to school. I believe they need to be back in school. All of us, even though we're educators, we all work in the service of children and families. And please know that we do our very best, because I'm a mom, I'm a grandma, and I always think about my work in education as not only do I want the best for my children, I want the best for your children. So please know that we're working collectively together. Many of us, we've never lived through a pandemic before, but we're doing our very best to make our schools a vibrant and welcoming place for your children to join us. So that would be a message that I want to leave with our families today. Pat.
Yeah, I'll comment just from the perspective I was overseeing or coordinating a counseling program that ran all summer. So when summer came, the government gave us the opportunity to continue on with students that were getting counseling. And we started right off with caseloads with the people that were able to come and do that work for us. And then over the summer, we were able to set it up that parents could call in and request new counseling to start up. In that environment, a big factor, of course, of the difficulty students were having was isolation and living with loss and loneliness, and their lives have changed sometimes to be confined with siblings or not. And so a lot of the students are really looking forward to the opportunity to get back and socialize, and again, we have to be creative how to set that up. There are, of course, students that are having very happy to be at home and are less inclined to be social, and they're probably the ones we really need to help to get out and be social the most. So I don't want to sugarcoat that. There are some children that are anxious about going back and maybe don't fit in so well, and we have to really help them to get there. And that probably our first order of business is going to be reaching out and seeing who the ones are that are having difficulties, not just promote the well-being and resilience of the ones that are doing so well and capture their excitement, but to reach out to some of those other ones and give them that chance to socialize and feel the connection with the teacher and the other students. So we're really looking forward to getting at that.
Great. Thanks, Pat. So I guess in closing, I would like to firstly thank all of you out there. Your questions have driven our discussion tonight. Hopefully we've provided you with some answers and some reassurance that school, while it may look a bit different this year, is a safe and will be an engaging space. I'd like to thank also our panelists, our partners from public health and from transportation. I would also like to make everyone aware that this session has actually been recorded and will be available on the board's social media accounts later this evening or perhaps early tomorrow. Again, I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and I would like to wish you a good night and stay safe.